Hey, Professor Zare, Sarah, or Christian, or whoever else is watching this. Bennie Hesser here, and for my Chemistry in the Kitchen final project, I will be making naturally leavened sourdough bread. I videotaped the whole process, and I'll be narrating it along through this video. Yeah, enjoy. So, it all starts with the sourdough starter. I got the sourdough starter from my uncle a few weeks ago, and I've been keeping it in my fridge. Right now, you're watching me feed the starter, a process in which I remove excess starter and add an equal weight ratio of flour, warm water, and existing sourdough starter. This starter was created by mixing water and flour and letting it develop into a functioning sourdough starter. Flour naturally contains a variety of yeasts and bacteria, and when it is mixed with water, the enzyme amylase breaks down the starch of the flour into the sugars glucose and maltose, which the natural yeast then metabolize. When given time and fed at proper intervals, it will create a stable culture. When in the fridge, the starter only needs to be fed once a week, but in order to activate the starter to make it baking ready, I had to leave it at room temperature and feed it every 12 hours for 5 days. It is important to feed it regularly because it helps prevent the starter from becoming too acidic, which would inhibit desirable lactobacilli and allow for less desirable acid-tolerant yeasts to dominate the starter. I'm now moving on to creating the dough for the sourdough loaf. The recipe I am following suggests using weight measurements instead of volume, as it is much more accurate because of the amount of gas in the starter can vary. I add 454 grams of the active starter, 602 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour with a protein content of 11.7%, 85 grams of whole wheat flour that has a protein content of around 14%, and then 397 grams of room temperature water. I then mix this together until it forms a soft, sticky, cohesive mass. And yes, I did put most of the clips on 2x speed so that I could fit it into a reasonably long video. I don't stir that fast normally. I promise. After stirring, at this point I let the dough rest for 20 minutes so that it could autolyze, a step that allows for the flour to absorb the water, which begins the dough's gluten formation and makes it easier to knead. After letting it autolyze, I kneaded the dough for about 5 minutes. This kneading process is essential for the bread. When the water is added to the flour, the gliadin and glutenin proteins in the flour expand to form strands of gluten. The kneading process warms and stretches these gluten strands and creates a springy and elastic dough. Creating these gluten networks is also essential because a strong gluten network traps the pockets of carbon dioxide that are produced by the yeast in the sourdough starter, which allows for the bread to rise and be light and airy as opposed to being heavy and dense if there is an insufficient gluten network. I also added salt at this stage, which both helps strengthen the gluten network and adds flavor. I'll also note at this point that bread is essentially a foam, and the gluten provides a structure for the air to be trapped in when creating the foam, which is then held in place by the cooking process. So, after kneading the dough, I let it rise at room temperature for 1 hour. As you'll see shortly, the dough does expand slightly, and this is due to the yeast producing carbon dioxide as they feed off sugars in the dough. The dough does not double in size quite like a normal yeast-based dough that I would make, and this is because my sourdough starter is not quite as active as packaged store-bought yeast. I then turn the dough out and gently fold it like a letter, being careful not to squish out any of the precious air bubbles that I've created. This folding process helps make the bubbles in the dough slightly more uniform, while also continuing to strengthen the gluten network. So after folding, the dough rises for another hour. Again, it didn't rise quite as much as I would have hoped, and I was definitely slightly concerned at this point. I came to the conclusion that my starter was not quite as active as it should have been, although, here's a little spoiler, the final product still turned out fantastic. So after the second rise was finished, I split the dough into 2 portions and pre-shaped the dough before letting it rest for another 20 minutes. The pre-shaping process is important because it creates the basic shape that the loaf will eventually be without refining the shape. When the dough is handled, the gluten tightens up, which makes it resistant to further shaping. By shaping it first, then letting it rest, it is much easier to shape into its final form. After the 20-minute rest was over, I shaped the dough into 2 tight rounds called boules, which is French for ball. The technique used here plays a significant role in determining the final crumb structure, and I think I definitely have a lot of room for improvement here. I then placed them into bowls lined with floured cloths and let them rise for 2.5 hours. So while I shape this final loaf, I'll talk a little bit about the baking process. So an hour before they were ready, I preheated my oven with a baking stone on the middle rack and a cast iron skillet below that. These are essential in forming a great crust on the loaf, as the baking stone provides an even, constant heat to the base of the loaf, and the cast iron skillet will be used to create steam. On the topic of crust, the tasty crust that we enjoy on the bread results from the Maillard reaction, which is a series of reactions between the sugars and amino acids in the dough. The steam that is added is super important for crust development, as it lowers the surface temperature of the loaves, which prevents the gluten from coagulating too soon and keeps the dough flexible for a longer period of time, which is essential in making sure that the final burst of fermentation from the yeast is contained in the loaf. Steam also plays a hand in crust color and prevents it from burning. When the crust hits 275 degrees Fahrenheit, its sugars start to caramelize, contributing to color and flavor. Between 302 degrees and 401 degrees, the crust browns even more thanks to the Maillard reaction. Since steam prevents the surface temperature from getting this high too early in the baking process, the inside of the loaf has time to cook through without risk of the crust becoming too dark. So, as you can see, after the final rise, I turned the loaves out onto some parchment paper and then scored the top of the loaves, which allows for more controlled expansion. I then put the loaves into the oven directly onto the baking stone, and then I added a cup of boiling water, which I'll do right here. So here's the boiling water. It gets added in to create that steam, and then close the oven door as quickly as possible so that the steam gets trapped in there. My loaves didn't stick on the stone too well, I had to reorganize them. So then, after about 35 minutes in the oven, it was time to remove the loaves from the oven. I noticed that in the future, I'll put them on 2 separate stones because they were a little too close together and they ended up connecting as they baked. But it still turned out absolutely delicious. And you can see the crust turned out great. Super happy with the way it turned out. I could also score them deeper next time, which is something I've learned. And but overall, the process was really good. The loaves turned out amazing, and I'm really pleased with the way it turned out. I also learned that we need a new serrated knife in my house because this serrated cheese knife was not doing the trick for me. So as you can see, as I cut it, the steam's just pouring out, and you can kind of check out the crumb structure. Pretty irregular air pocket sizes, so that's something that I can definitely work to improve on in the future. Just changing up some of my kneading techniques or the way that I treat it as it's rising to kind of make that a little more regular. But in this second slice, the crumb is actually a lot better. There's more regular kind of sourdough-esque pockets. And yeah, it turned out great. So there you have it, naturally leavened sourdough bread. Thanks for watching and thanks for an absolutely great quarter. I'll never look at food the same.